be in Revelation chapter 18, verses 1 through 5. After this, I saw an angel with great authority coming down from heaven, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. He called out in a mighty voice, "It has fallen. Babylon the Great has fallen. She has become a home for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, and a haunt for every unclean and despicable beast. For all the nations have drunk the wine of her sexual immorality, which brings wrath. The kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown wealthy from her sensuality and excess." Then I heard another voice from heaven, "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins or receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes." That's the Lord's word for us today. You may be seated.
All right, Steve, what do you think of starting your day with those verses? Yeah. And your assignment this week is to use the word haunt. How often do we see that? Except around Halloween, maybe. So, thank you, Tim, for your prayers on my behalf as we look into Revelation again this morning. As you know, if you're new to Wingfoot, I'm not sabbatical this summer, which I think is a really great idea. Thank you as a church, the elders and the church, to giving that to John and Kelly. I just think that's a wonderful idea. It's becoming more popular in churches, or more common in churches, and that started like the year after I retired, but that's okay. But no, thank you for that. I think that's just a really great thing. So we're in the midst of a mini-series, a 3-week series. So this is week 2, so we're in the midst of it in the book of Revelation. Obviously, we're taking a really high view of Revelation. We're just going to look at themes and that kind of stuff. We're not getting into the nitty-gritty. But we're in week 2 of Revelation as it talks about the mission of God. So that's why I call it Apocalypse and the mission of God. And by that I mean just what is God doing? What is he up to? What is his plans in the broad sense in the world? And as far as we're concerned, how are we a part of that? What does he hope from us? And just to get a running start here, if you remember last week we said a couple things. I said a couple things about apocalypse. First is that even the word apocalypse, I picked that, I could have said Revelation, I picked apocalypse partially because it's a little more emotive, it's a little more edgy, but partially is because in the context that we're talking, apocalypse doesn't mean the end of the world. It doesn't mean the collapse of civilization. It doesn't mean all hell breaking loose and the end of everything. Now, that is true in the context of movies and TVs and video games and comic books. Apocalypse does mean that. It's come to mean that in that context. But in our context, in the biblical context, in the context of ancient Jewish literature, apocalypse means to reveal. It's a revealing, an unveiling. That's why in English we call it revelation. It tells us something. So that's the first thing about apocalypse that we looked at last week. The second thing is that the book of Revelation is more than just prophecy about what's going to happen in the future. From the perspective of the church, from the time it was written, it has an immediate and ongoing relevance and application. I believe that every believer, every church in any age can read this and say, yes, that time is near, it is happening, and we can be blessed by it. So two aspects of foundational aspects of Revelation, that it's not just about the end of the world, it's an unveiling, a revealing of what God is doing, and it's more than just a prophecy. Now, most of us, I would say, because of where we live in the United States, where we were and when we were born within the last, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say we're all born within the last, say, 150 years. Yeah, I'm hedging my bet. But most of us, because of where we were born, when we grew up, are probably familiar with Revelation specifically or maybe even exclusively as prophecy, as the outline of a series of events that will take place in quick succession, in some scenarios, a 7-year period, at some point, all in the future. That, yeah, you got the letters 1, 2, and 3, chapters 1, 2, and 3, and the 7 letters to the churches in Revelation, and those are applicable today. But in most teachings, in most books that were most things that we're familiar with because of our location and our time, is that everything from chapters 4 to roughly 19 or 20 is a 7-year period somewhere in the future. And when we look at Revelation in that narrower of a scope, then the book becomes something to decode. It becomes a ministry to solve. So we've got 666, we've got the mark of the beast, we've got 4 horsemen, we've got these plagues that are described. And when we're thinking in a sense where the whole thing is purely future and very specific, then we start looking at it to decode it. I want to consider a different approach. I want to encourage you to enter in, consider a different approach if you never have. And that is that Revelation presents God's judgment against evil throughout the entire church history, from Jesus' first advent to his second coming, a series of judgments. And as people start laying this out, we start noticing in Revelation how there's a certain pattern of repetition where opposition to God and the characters that oppose God are introduced, and then they're judged. There's a judgment. And then there's an introduction of even worse characters. And there's even a more severe judgment. And then there seems to be the final characters and a final judgment. And scholars have looked at this, and over the 2,000 years of church history have seen this. Well, maybe this is a pattern that repeats itself over and over and over again in church history. And when we look at Revelation from that point of view, then it becomes not something to decode and who fits the pattern of 666, or what might this mark be that we have to put on our foreheads, and how literal is that? It doesn't become that as much as it becomes a window into what God is doing, what he's doing now, and what we should be doing as well. And as I argued last week, it also kind of frees up some of the problems of Revelation saying the time is near. Yes, it's near because it's here now. And how can it be a blessing if it's just nothing more than trying to figure out who fits which symbol? How do we how can we do it? So, last week, I ended with 2 broad applications. All right, the first is that Revelation is not just a book about the things that will take place, it's about how God is working now. That's sort of where we've been camping the last few minutes. As a point of application, though, I said, since God is on a mission, Revelation is a blessing of hope and challenge to nonconformity in the present. Revelation gives hope. It speaks to the persecuted church. It speaks to churches that maybe aren't persecuted, but they're facing opposition from their culture, from their world. It speaks to those who maybe they're not facing open persecution or opposition, but we're just weary of the evil and the we see. Comes from a Greek word that means, just the stuff we see in this world that makes us weary. To those type of Christians, it says, hang on. Persevere. God has a plan. And more than just has a plan, God is executing that plan. In some ways, he is currently judging evil. And evil, in some respects, judges itself because it can't stand under the weight of its own condemnation. Revelation gives hope. Revelation gives a challenge of nonconformity, a challenge of resistance. It speaks to those living in a culture, in an empire that are attempted to accommodate their faith to the culture around them. It says, do not conform to the age in which you live. Do not align yourselves too much with the powers that be. It says to believers, it challenges believers, be different, resist. Or as we saw in the text, come out. Don't be a part of that. So, this week I want to run with those two themes, the theme of hope and the theme of challenge. Although we're just going to look at them with a little more specificity, a little more specific in how we apply that. All right, so we're starting with Revelation 18. So you can see we skipped a bunch of stuff. Last week we were in chapter 1, this week we're in chapter 18. We're almost done. Revelation 18, 1 and 2. After this, I saw another angel with great authority coming down from heaven, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. And he called out with a mighty voice, "It has fallen. Babylon the Great has fallen." All right, now, if you were in, I say 2a because we're stopping at the very beginning. That means we're just stopping at the first half of verse 2. If you were in the class that we taught last spring on how to study your Bible in that, and you start a new chapter and you see, after this I saw, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? What's that? Exactly, thank you. Yes, after what? Revelation 17. And Revelation 17 describes two symbolic characters. It describes Babylon the Great. And if we looked at that and we read all the verses, which we're not going to, you'll see that then in a sense, Babylon the Great is described or symbolic of evil organized evil, systemic or structural evil. In a sense, in this context, it's personified, but behind it is this idea of an organized evil. In this context, Babylon is great, but great isn't good. Babylon tempts, Babylon allures, seduces the world into evil and away from the things of God. Sometimes Babylon opposes God openly and directly. Sometimes I think Babylon opposes God almost passively in the sense that she just sort of ignores the existence of God and teaches things opposed to God without maybe directly saying there is no God or I oppose God. But she allures and tempts the world away from God into evil. And in the context of us being part of the world, the church as well. Babylon the Great. Babylon is introduced in Revelation 17. And so there's a beast as well. The beast carries the woman. And in chapter 17, there's a description of this beast and how the beast carries the woman. So the woman riding on this beast. So the symbolism there is that this is the structural or the whatever is behind the evil that carries it along, that supports it. So this whole picture of Babylon, of this seductive woman on this beast, is an idea of corporate corruption, of industry, economics, and the media, and the arts, and the politics, that when all of those things combined, when those systems and those structures in the world are either openly or even passively opposing God and luring the church away, if they promote immorality, promote injustice, when they promote death, when they promote greed, when they oppose the church and ignore the things of God, that is Babylon. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen Babylon. Babylon, or the beasts for that matter, the beasts, there's two beasts introduced in chapters 13. And this is where, in chapter 13, when there's the sea beast and then there's the land beast, and this is where you really get into the things that we love to decode, because it's in chapters 13 and 14 that you get the number of the beast, 666. And then there's the idea of taking the mark of the beast and the warnings against that. And chapters 14 talks about the 144,000, which are sealed believers in contrast to those that took the mark of the beast. And a lot of great stuff in there to decode. But what we see is the introduction of this of Babylon. Babylon shows up again in chapter 14. So what we see in chapters 13 and 14 are the introduction of beasts in Babylon there. And then in 15 and 16, we see their judgment and their downfall. Again, we see it introduced in chapter 17, and then we see it judged in chapters 18 and 19. And we see this pattern in Revelation, and that's why I'm convinced, and I'll leave it up to you what you think, but that's why I'm convinced that when you start looking at the patterns, you see evil personified, evil judged. Evil personified, evil judged. And in the midst of that, whether it's a call like we have today to come out of that, or even back in chapters 13 and 14, 144,000, which is an obviously symbolic number of believers being sealed out of that. So instead of trying to decode the symbols, who fits 666, which we've been trying to do for decades, is that Ronald Reagan, because I think his first, middle, and last name all have 6 letters. Oh, how obvious is that? Or the Pope. There's something about the Pope in Latin and all that, 666, or Obama, or Putin, or whatever. Or the mark of the beast. We've been trying to figure out the mark of the beast, for 100 years. We've been trying to, most recently, is it some kind of chip that gets implanted in us? Or before that, back in the 70s or the 80s, it was the barcodes. And even back as far as the 1930s, it was, oh no, Social Security. Sorry, Steve. Everybody has to have a number. Everybody has to have a number. And if you don't have that number, if you don't have that mark, you can't, So instead of trying to decode all that, what if in every age there are beasts and there are antichrists? What if in every age this is relevant to the church? Now, I'm leaving open the fact that maybe there'll be a time in the future when this is all fulfilled in a more specific or maybe a very specific way. But what if in the meantime, every age has had its beasts, its empires, its Babylon? Babylon is fallen. That's the hope that the church has when we're weary of the evil, when we're weary or facing persecution. It has fallen. Obviously, it's still here, but it's been judged and being judged and will be ultimately judged. All right, let's keep going. Let's just jump down to the challenge. Verses 4 and 5. Then I heard another voice from heaven. Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins and receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Come out of her, my people. So just like in every age there are empires and Babylons and beasts, so also in every age the church is challenged to come out, to be different, to resist, to do not conform. These are the twofold themes we're running with this morning, this idea of hope and challenge. And one observation I'd like to make is that the challenge of hope is sort of a general challenge. Verses 1 and 2 are kind of a, hear ye, Babylon has fallen. Verses 4 and 5, I think, are a little bit more specific. It's more of a specific call. It's not a hear ye to the whole world. It's more of a, to those who have ears to hear, come out of her, my people. Hope and challenge. So, what did the early church think of this? This is one of the problems with thinking of Revelation as purely future is, how was it received by the people who first read it? Those 7 churches in Revelation that are listed were all churches that existed. Those aren't symbolic. Those are 7 churches that received this. And it was to be a blessing, and they were to do it. When the early church heard this, and particularly when they heard talk about Babylon, what came to their mind? I don't think there's any way, thank you, Steve. I don't think there's any way that the early believers heard this and didn't think about Rome. both the city and the empire in which they lived. Rome, the world's largest, most powerful, and richest empire of its time. Rome that extended from the Hadrian's Wall in what is now England all the way through Europe and the Middle East and down around into Egypt and other parts east. A massive, powerful, rich empire. An empire that believed it was given the divine right to rule the world, to dominate other nations, and that it had a destiny, a purpose, a divine right to shape history according to its agenda. Rome was number one, and the believers lived in the midst of that. And so under Rome then, I believe that the Roman church faced two primary threats in the broad scheme of things. There was the threat of persecution, of active persecution. There were threats. If you lived in imperial Rome and you were a Christian, there was always the threat, the ever-present threat of persecution, of violence against you because of your faith. Now, it was always ever present as a threat. If you look at the church history under Rome, there were times when there was severe persecution, and there were times of peace. So it kind of ebbed and flowed. And depending on where you lived, too, the closer you lived to Rome, the more likely you were to face persecution. And so it kind of ebbed and flowed. But there was this always present threat. There was also the threat of accommodation. There were benefits to living in Rome. There was economic prosperity in Rome. Because of the military dominance of Rome, there was the phenomenon that they call the Pax Romana. There was a peace. In a sense, there was a peace in the whole known world there at that time because Rome dominated everything. So just remember when the Soviet Union fell? What was the first thing that happened when the Soviet Union fell? The ethnic strife that happened in the Balkans between the Bosniaks and the Croatians and the Serbs and all of that had been suppressed for a generation because, in a sense, call it Pax, whatever the Latin for Soviet Union would be. But because of in a sense, the oppression or the power of the Soviet Union, it suppressed all that. In a sense, living in the Roman Empire as well, the Pax Romana, because of their military dominance. There was a civil religion in Rome that was easy to take part of, and everybody did, and emperor worship and all of that. And there was a sexual openness in Rome as well. We think about that as a modern phenomenon, but people have been people from day one. The temptation during those times of peace for believers was to accommodate and conform as well. So then, under the early church, when they first read this, I think the message was very similar. The applications are completely different, but the message is very similar. A hope when facing persecution and opposition or weariness to evil, as well as a challenge to not accommodate. So what about now? You think now, the church is worldwide. And in a lot of countries, we're no longer a minority. And Christians living in the world today live in all kinds of situations, of course. There are many Christians, millions of Christians around the world that this day, when they gather together, do so with the threat of persecution or the threat of cultural violence or even a governmental pogrom against them. They live with the threat of open opposition and persecution. There are others, like ourselves, who live, as far as it's concerned with our faith, peaceful lives without open threat to persecution. And in some cultures, Christians even enjoy a certain dominance or of influence over their culture. So if you look at the church then and the church now, and what do we do with ourselves? Where do we fit into this? 75 believers gathering together in this room at this time. Where do we fit in? And how does all of that the hope and the challenge fit to us? I think the first thing is to acknowledge our location and our situation. The world population today is roughly 8.2 billion people. And I think if we took a poll, which would be completely impossible, but if you could take a poll of the 8.2 billion people in the world and you ask them, what country in the world today is the richest and most powerful at this time? What would their answer be? If you ask those 8.2 billion people, what nation on earth acts as if it believes it has a manifest destiny to maybe not rule, but certainly influence all the other nations, and whose agenda is number one, what would they say? Who does that sound like? It sounds like us. It sounds like us both us. It sounds like us both U.S. us. In many ways, we live in a modern-day Roman Empire. We live in Babylon. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm going to start walking a pretty balanced line. Because on the one hand, I don't want to trash America. I mean, there's so much about our country that is so great. And even as a secular culture, even as so much of what we've done and do is so good in the world. Our what's the word I'm looking for? Our donations, our generosity to the world is so great. There's so many good things about the United States. So I'm not saying the United States is the epitome of an evil empire. But there are a lot of things about the United States, both now and particularly in our history, that maybe isn't so good. Well, there's no maybe about it. There are things that we don't like to teach because it doesn't fit the mold. So at the same time, I want to say we are a great country and we do good things. At the other time, we are, in so many respects, a modern Babylon. One writer, one theologian that I read said, any society whom Babylon's cap fits must wear it. And we don't have colonies like old empires did in that, but we are big, and we are rich, and we are powerful, and we are dominant. And this idea of the United States kind of being a modern Roman Empire, this isn't all that new. Take a look at this picture. Do you know what this is? There we go. Thank you. All right, more coffee for the guys in the back. Okay, no, just kidding. That is. It's the Capitol Rotunda in Washington. So everybody knows the Capitol. You know the big dome that's in the center of the Capitol. This is the rotunda if you were standing inside of it. And if you just to get the sense of scale, you see the people standing there at the bottom. And so how big are those pictures and how big is that dome? Now, you see that the big gold circle, that's the top of the dome. And in the center of that is a fresco. See the little paintings? It's kind of small on that. Here's a close-up picture of that one. Go to the next one, please. Here's a close-up of that fresco, all right? So, like a lot of frescoes, like a lot of both cathedrals and government buildings, there's a fresco at the top. And what's kind of hard to see is in the center circle, the person in the middle of the center circle, which looks like he has an Afghan on his lap, that's George Washington. Zoom in on George Washington. Boom. All right? Now, there's George Washington sitting over the Capitol building, sitting on the clouds with a purple cloth draped across his lap and a downward sword. None of that is accidental. It's all symbolic. And you know who else in history was depicted as wearing purple robes and holding downward pointing swords? Roman emperors that conquered. And on his left, on the right is victory. She's got the laurel on her head. That's what victors were given, that crown of laurel. And on his right, our left, is liberty. And for some reason, liberty always wears a red stocking cap. It has something to do with the French, I don't know. But this is George Washington sitting in the heavens, exalted. And the title of this is called The Apotheosis of George Washington, which literally means the deification of George Washington. So I'm not the first one to make these parallels between the United States and the Roman Empire. Now, again, balanced view here. We're not hating on the United States, wanting us to view us with a good and proper context. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a hope and a challenge. The hope. Babylon. Babylon has fallen. All the evil, all the injustice, everything that we see around us has been judged and will be judged ultimately. There are a lot of things around us that could lead us to despair with the evil and the injustice and the things that are going on now that have always gone on in a very cyclical way. But there is hope. Babylon has fallen. I think in our context, though, I think what's more relevant to us in the broad scheme of things is the challenge. Because we're not facing persecution and opposition nearly in the sense that I think sometimes we feel we do. Certainly not in the sense that many Christians in the world have and are now. So I want to take a look at ways that we can, warnings, ways that we can resist. What does it mean to come out of her, my people? Now, I'm not saying we become Amish or completely separate ourselves. That's way too literal. What I'd like to do, I'd like to offer three ways I think in broad sense that we can come out, or ways that I see the church as resisting accommodation, or quite frankly, ways I see the church conforming to this age that I hope, and when I say church, I'm thinking big picture church. I'm not thinking of like any of you, but what do I know? And the first thing is to resist the economics of the empire. It's interesting. If we read the rest of chapter 18, verse 11, verse 15, verse 17, all mentions merchants. And it talks about the opulent luxuries of Rome. It talks about the opulent luxuries of life. Earlier in the book, back in chapters 4, 5, somewhere in there, early in the book, we're introduced to the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We're all familiar with that. One of those horsemen includes an allusion to economic inequality. So this isn't a prohibition against luxury items. It's not a call to poverty or austerity. Is it getting... Oh, we almost made it. All right. It's a call to see. It's a call to resist the economic disparities and injustices that we see around us. It's a call to be aware of how our spending, our voting, our living opposes or perpetuates inequality. How does it oppose or perpetuate the standard of living of others? How does it oppose or perpetuate the destruction of our environment? How does it oppose or perpetuate the thriving of others, not just ourselves? It's a call to see and be aware of economic disparity and injustices and the systems that exist that perpetuate this. So throughout the apocalypse, we see God judging the economics of the empire and challenging our involvement. And again, it's not a call to poverty or austerity. I mean, I think people have historically, there have been Christians that have taken that route, and good for them, but I don't think that's what it's telling us we have to do. But it's having a eyes to see and to be aware of and resist the economics of the empire. That's number one. Number two is to resist the self-glorification of the empire. And I'd add to that the self-glorification and the violence of the empire. Now, I'm not opposed to patriotism. Patriotism is fine. I'm not saying we can't, we're not going the route of some churches that refuse to celebrate, secular holidays or any holidays or this isn't in opposition to being in the military or anything like that. I'm just saying that resisting the extreme sometimes in the self-glorification and the violence that we see in our empire, in our culture. The three horsemen, there's four horsemen of the apocalypse that I mentioned before, but three of the four horsemen represent war, which produces famine, which produces death. And I believe throughout Scripture, it's God's call to His people to pursue, as much as possible, a non-violent life. Now, I'm not saying it's a call to pacifism. It's not a prohibition against being in the military or law enforcement or ever using that. I don't want to go that far. But it is a call to resist an unbalanced, and I get that that's very subjective. What's balanced to one person might be unbalanced to another. But it's a call to think about, to see the glorification and reliance on violence. I think it's also a call to remind ourselves that we are not first and foremost Americans. We are Americans. And I believe we have a right to be proud of our country and should be. But we are first and foremost earthlings. And our situation is somewhere else. Our citizenship is somewhere else. So, the call is to resist. To be aware of how we participate in the glorification of war and violence. And that, even on the verbal level. So that when we talk about the people on the other side of the aisle politically, are we out to own and destroy the libs? Or are we out to destroy the MAGA church? How much do we participate even in the verbal violence? And to become aware, just to notice how much of America and how much of our culture glorifies violence. The third one is to resist the sensual, to resist the sexual openness of our empire. Revelation 18 talks a lot about, and throughout the whole book, there are lots of references to the temptation, to the temptation to sexual immorality. And I believe that's both metaphorical and literal. Metaphorical in the sense that seduction is a great metaphor for anything that allures, that draws people into sin or away from God. It's a great metaphor for any type of sin or drawing people away. But our culture is also very into sensuality and sexuality. And there's a major theme in Revelation about not conforming to the culture in that sense. It's a call to resist. Now, this is one where I think evangelical churches in general, evangelical churches as a whole, are pretty good at this in the sense that there are a lot of voices out there in the world that are opposing homosexuality or same-sex marriage, or there's even more push now to easy divorce and no-fault divorce and that. The church has been, again, big picture church, evangelicals in particular, a lot of voices out there on this one. And I think that's good because it is a call, it is a challenge. I think in the broad scheme of things, though, that I think maybe in a lot of churches that's been overemphasized. Not that it shouldn't be emphasized, but it's been overemphasized to the detriment of these other things as well, that maybe we're just a little bit more comfortable with. All right, so Revelation, an apocalypse, a revealing, an unveiling. It's a call to have hope in the face of opposition and weariness of evil. It's a challenge to resist in the face of alluring aspects of our culture. However, Revelation is also a prophecy. The book ends with John calling it a prophecy. It says, if anybody adds, you know the verse, if anybody adds or takes away the words of this prophecy. So in some respects, it is a description of what will happen. It is a description and a prediction. It is a prophecy about how things will end and what will it be like after the end. Well, maybe that's not logical. How do you have something after an end? But anyway, what will things be like? Well, that's where we're going. That's where we'll be next week. So come back and hear that.